Welcome to our next training video in the 1 Corinthians series, which will be in chapters 11 to 16, connecting the resurrection to life. Of course, the grand chapter is chapter 15, whereas the cross was primarily in focus in chapters 1 to 10. You could say that the resurrection is in focus in verses 11 to 16, though that's a simplification. We know the resurrection is referred to before and after. We'll see that as we go. But we're going to look at chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, which talks about equality and distinction between the sexes, in particular marriage. This has often been a difficult passage for people. People have fallen on different lines on this, and so I'd say you should just graciously go through the study in love towards one another, and just keeping in mind, it seems, as I'll try and show, that Paul is trying to apply a cultural thing to a biblical principle, or basically trying to maintain a biblical principle in a cultural context, which still applies today. But just very importantly, as we get into this passage, we need to keep in mind the general principle Paul has set out in chapters 8, verse 1, actually, which is knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Meaning, even though they had a knowledge that we are liberated in Christ, everything is permissible. That does not negate the principle of love, which is building one another up. And so when they have to consider their Christian lives, love should be the dominant ethic, love towards one another, because this is how we glorify God, when we love one another. So whether you eat or drink, as he concludes this argument, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. How can you do something to the glory of God? By how you love people. Notice, give no offense to Jews or to Greeks, the non-Christians, or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, because that is not the principle of love, but that of many, that they may be saved. It is for their benefit that I do certain things. As he pointed out previously, to the Jew I've become a Jew, to the Greek I've become a Greek, in order to save some. So keep that in mind. And really, the principle is laid down by Christ. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. But they're not doing that. They're not doing that regarding idol festivals. They're not doing that now regarding equality and distinction of sexes in marriage. They're trying to follow this liberty principle, which is true in the gospel, but does not negate love. And so Paul's going to try and correct that issue in the church. But some important terms just to understand, man and woman, which you'll hear the whole time, seems to refer, I think, just looking at the general context and where the terms are used in the specific context, it refers to husband and wife, how the ESV translates it. And the reason for that, we could argue, is in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11 to 15, Ephesians 5:31, where these terms are used, and Paul uses Genesis 2 to 3, which he uses here in chapter 11, verse 2 to 16, all point back to the first marriage relationship, Adam and Eve, the husband and wife. Also the term head, which is used extensively in our passage, it's only explored regarding human relationships in Ephesians 5, verse 22 to 33, which refers to marriage. So it seems strongly, or it suggests strongly, that Paul is addressing husbands and wives. Also keep in mind, Paul's already addressed marriage in chapter 7, so it's very likely that he's still continuing to some degree to apply these principles. What does it mean to glorify God and not to cause offense in the context of marriage relationships, husbands and wives, and how they relate to one another in the church and outside, if that makes sense. But then, of course, another term which we might find confusing is the term head covering. Remember, again, Paul is addressing issues particular to Corinth, like pagan festivals, in chapters 8 to 10. And Finney really gives a lovely summary. You've got these citations and quotes in the group guide and in the leader's guide, but he summarizes to understand the cultural context. For women, at least in some Greco-Roman context, it would appear that when venturing outside the home, they would normally wear a head covering and a veil. Valerius Maximus describes how Sulpicius Gallus, consul in 166 before Christ, divorced his wife due to appearing uncovered in public. It was a disgrace. And Plutarch maintains that it's more usual for women to go forth in public with their heads covered. This is the cultural expression of sexual purity and marital fidelity. While head shaved, which Paul will refer to here, is actually a sign of a wife being caught in adultery or refusing to recognize her relationship with her husband, which again indicates head coverings was a way of showing I am married, I am under my husband, we are a marriage unit. It shows that distinction. And so taking your head covering off was tentatively basically saying you're refusing to recognize the relationship, you're free, you're available, it's being adulterous culturally, or that's how it would be interpreted. So the modern day equivalent would be, for example, at least for us, wearing your wedding ring, or some people do sometimes when they want to show they're available, take off their wedding ring. And so arguing from that perspective, I'm free in Christ, which is terrible. But getting into this passage, it would seem, remember, it's about glorifying God, and you glorify God by how you relate to those outside and inside the church. And so as Paul begins regarding the different church traditions that they have, Paul gives them a biblical principle here, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now this term head, kephale, just from the reading I've done, you can see more notes, it would refer to, it seems, source and authority. They're interrelated with one another. And so he's saying that the source and authority of every man is Christ. And of course, the source and authority of every wife is her husband, and the source and authority of Christ is God. Now, very importantly to see here is that he sees there's a correlation between the relationship that the Son and the Father have and the relationship between a husband and a wife. And this is the principle laid down. And so Paul says you need to maintain this principle in your church gatherings, and this is how you do it. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors, does not bring glory to his head, Christ. But every wife who prays or prophesies with the head uncovered dishonors her head, the husband, since it is the same as if her head were shaven, because she's basically not showing her marital distinction and marital fidelity and commitment. So it's as if publicly she's displaying a sense of contempt to a marriage relationship and even coming across as if she's adulterous. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short, as if she's committed adultery. But since it is disgraceful, it does not bring honor culturally to both man and ultimately to God, for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. So in order to maintain this principle, head coverings in the Greco-Roman context was the way of showing it in the marriage relationship. And so why should they be doing this? Then he gives sort of a biblical foundation for this, maintaining this cultural distinction within marriage. And he argues basically from Genesis 1 to 26 to 27 and chapter 2 verse 18 to 23. It's like a summary. For he says, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of God. But the wife is the glory of man. And then he explains what he means. For a man was not made from woman. If you read Genesis 2, that is pretty clear. He was made from the dust by God, but woman from man. She was made from his rib. Neither was man created for woman, but woman was created for man. It's not good for a man to be alone. He needs a strong helper, someone who's opposite to him, a suitable strong helper. And so woman was created to complete and ultimately in this relationship mirror this relationship between Father and Son, which is in God himself. And so he lays down this idea and saying basically that head coverings is a way of showing this relationship. Head coverings in this context is a symbol of authority on her head. And if you want to, and just on this little reference, because of the angels, you need to keep in mind that the church of God is not just a witness to the visible world that you see and people around you, but also to the hosts of heaven, the angelic host. We witness to basically the invisible and the visible. And so everything is important in what we do. But very importantly, although there is a difference between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, that does not mean they're not equal. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, now man is now born of woman. And you can see that in Genesis 3:20 and 4:1. And all things are from God. They are different and yet codependent on one another and equal with one another. And this is how God has designed us, different yet equal. And this needs to be maintained in whatever cultural practice is the dominant practice of the day. And that's what Paul appeals to at the end. What is proper? Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? In their cultural context, no. What looks natural to them back then? No. Her head should be covered. And this seems to be the general practice of the churches back then. But really, what you want your people to walk away with is that we need to respect and celebrate the gender distinctions with which we have been created. Men and women are different and equal, and that's wonderful, and we should celebrate it. And we should respect culturally specific approaches to guarding moral and sexual purity. We should have the high road as a church family, and we should show this. And of course, you've noticed in this passage that there are references to women prophesying and praying in the church family. And so I would say begin looking at women and their gifts in the worshiping community, and encourage people to read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 to 14. And that, I would say, in a nutshell, is what we'll be looking at in our first study.